the recording when you are ready.
Yeah.
Okay. There's some technical glitch. Just 1 minute. Yeah. Shall we start?
Yes.
All right.
So I can go ahead?
Yeah, I'll just begin.
Okay, sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Doing Sociology. Today, we have Dr. Preeti Raghunath with us. She is a lecturer at Monash University, Malaysia. She works at the intersections of critical media policy and media anthropology. Her book titled Community Radio Policies in South Asia, a Deliberative Policy Ecology Approach was published as part of the Palgrave Studies in Communication for Social Change series. She is currently working on data policies and practices in South and Southeast Asia. Preeti, I extend my heartiest greetings to you and welcome to Doing Sociology. All of us are very excited to listen to you, and apologies to everyone for my bad voice.
Thank you so much, Rituparna, for inviting me and allowing me to be part of this fantastic blog and series that you have going on at Doing Sociology. For me, it's such an honor to be able to address people who follow the blog regularly, and congratulations on completing 2 years yesterday, I think, or around the corner. Well, so a little bit, you've already done a great job introducing me. Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. So without much further ado, I think I'll just jump right into the conversation that I wanted to sort of start today, which is on datafication broadly, but more specifically on data governance in South and Southeast Asia. So it is called As If There Were People, and this is this is just the beginning of a project that I've envisaged for the next couple of years at least, where I want to be doing research on data governance in India, Singapore, and Malaysia. These are the 3 countries that I'm looking at as part of the larger vision to bring in work that connects South and Southeast Asia. Just by way of introduction, I've studied and lived all my life in India, and I did my PhD from the University of Hyderabad in communication. And prior to that, I did a master's in international relations and politics from JNU. I'm currently working in Monash University, Malaysia as a lecturer in communication and media studies. And this is part of my newer project and newer research. And therefore, this is not something that is already been completed. This is very much a pitch that seeks to sort of outline the vision for my research over the next couple of years. And a little bit about the background to my work. Data and work around quantification of human life is not something that's new. Modernity, colonial and capitalist modernity brought with it various ways and means of quantifying human life. This was brought in the form of censuses. This was brought in the form of anthropometry, where measurements were brought in of a certain variety. And therefore, it was very much part of a colonial enterprise. Datafication, I argue, was very much part of a colonial enterprise to sort of quantify and render intelligible the lives of human beings in this part of the world, in the colonies that were to render themselves intelligible to the colonial powers. And there are, of course, contentions and arguments that datafication has always been there in human society. And while I acknowledge that, the caveat is that my work specifically looks at datafication in the modern times. So what do you mean by datafication today? While it's always been there in society across various eras and ages, the modernity brought with it a particular kind of datafication. And today what we are seeing in late capitalism is a very specific kind of datafication that is driven by high technology. And when I say high technology, I mean artificial intelligence, machine learning induced technologies and algorithms that play a big role in rendering the human being intelligible to intelligence systems, right? So this is just an example of an ad that I just saw the other day, a couple of days ago, while I was walking around. And It literally says datafy your life. So there's a lot of value that's being added to datafication, and I mean, we are also called upon to datafy our lives. And therefore, really, we are at the juncture where high technologies are being deployed on an everyday basis and are, sort of a part of systems that we interact with in our everyday life. So it is very much part of the everyday. It is very much not something that is only limited to a few people. It is all pervasive in that sense, right? So that is by way of the background. And today we have national governments and regional bodies like the EU exploring how data governance can be brought in. So while datafication itself is being driven by corporations, it's being driven by governments, they're also talking about data governance in a big way. So what does data governance mean? Data governance essentially means that these are frameworks, these are policy, public policy, and also private policy frameworks that seek to govern how data is being gathered, how data is being processed, how data is being stored, and how data is being managed in various ways, and how it's being put to use in various ways. So accompanying that, you have a whole lot of imaginaries, you have a whole lot of, you have vision statements by corporations and governments as to how they see data and how they see people as data. And that's really where my work is located. So a little bit about the focus of my work. I'm not interested in just the study of data governance because I believe that the lawyers and legal experts are doing a fantastic job already of sort of looking at the legal clauses and the policy frameworks for data that are already being envisaged by governments, that are being put in place by governments. For instance, in India, you have the Personal Data Protection Bill, which is now in the parliament. You have the non-personal data report, iterations of it, which have been discussed with civil society, with corporations and industry, and with, and they're now talking about governing data flows and cross-border data flows with other countries. So the geopolitical angle also comes into the picture. And all of this is being managed fantastically by legal firms and lawyers. My own work, because my, in terms of my bent, I come from a media anthropology perspective, and I am looking at conducting an ethnography, and I really believe in bringing slice of life kind of stories to the picture of policy. I'm really interested in historicizing and contextualizing data governance in India. And I'll come to the next bit about the associated mobilities in Singapore and Malaysia. So the focus really is on contextualizing the present times where conversations around data governance are taking place in India. So, it's sort of seen as a revolutionary moment where data is seen as the new oil. It's seen as a great resource that can really pump economic development and progress, and therefore bring in revolutionary changes in the envisaged digital India. And there are numerous policy frameworks that are being pushed in this direction in order to govern data and to set the standards for data. The government is talking about a data protection authority. They're talking about various kinds of data like personal and non-personal data. Civil society is talking about cooperative data governance, where they're talking about data trusts and data stewardship models. So there's a lot of conversation in this space, but academically, we've not been able to really capture it and contextualize it in the present moment, given the histories and the socioeconomic, political, and cultural context that India as a country has, and in plural, and also associated mobilities with Singapore and Malaysia. And I bring Singapore and Malaysia, because I'm located in Southeast Asia right now, and it makes a lot of sense to understand the continuities and disjunctures historically and in present times in terms of the flow of people, and therefore the way they're looked at as data during the colony, but also in present times in terms of trade relations and similar such areas. So that is really the focus of my work. And therefore, I see that there are three elements that come into the picture when I talk about my approach to the study of data governance. The first is to unravel what are the data imaginaries. So when one talks about, a forthcoming Digital India Act, for instance, which is being spoken about, or, a slew of policy measures which seek to capitalize on this sort of the plethora of data available in order to aid the country's progress, what are we imagining that data can do for us? I mean, what is the potential we envisage in data? And mind you, this is people as data, right? So it's not just an abstraction that is data, but people being rendered as data through high technology. What are we imagining these data sets will deliver for us? What are the imaginaries like? There are, of course, for instance, there are, of course, imaginaries of linear progress, where we believe that we will leapfrog into a digital economy, and therefore it will be a linear model where we're going to sort of gain immensely from the huge population that we have, and therefore the huge amounts of data that we really have access to of the population along various lines, right? So that is one angle that I'm looking at. The second is to look at the kind of actors in data governance. And this follows from my previous work, where I looked at the various kinds of, to use that word, stakeholders, but essentially the various multiple levels and various kinds of people involved in making policy. We often think of, policy as something that the government does, or calls various other people for consultations with. But really, it is a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more complex, and there's a lot in flux when it comes to policy. There are numerous ministries involved, and there's a back and forth between various ministries, and therefore the government is not a monolith. There are international and multilateral organizations and donor agencies which sort of set various international agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals. You have the World Bank, which is talking about data for development. Similarly, you have civil society, and civil society is also not a monolith. You have certain kinds of think tanks, you have activist groups, you have advocates for policy measures, and you have the lobby groups. And therefore, this makes the ecosystem of data governance very, very complex. And it is these multitude of interactions that I see happening in the data governance space that I seek to sort of study when to understand these data imaginaries. So while we talk about data imaginaries from the government, we have a plethora of actors in the data governance space who also have competing imaginaries or conciliatory imaginaries, and how they interact with each other, what are their interests like, and how do they negotiate with each other in piecing together this aspect of data governance is something that I'm looking at. And the third aspect is to then look at people on ground. What are people's experiences historically and in present times of being governed as data? So for instance, I was reading a 1926 document which looks at the migration, the statistics of migration from British India to the colonies, to the British colonies in various other parts of the world, the Caribbean, for instance, and Southeast Asia, British Malaya being, and the Strait settlements being very much part of the picture. And I was looking at how at various junctures, people who were transported at one juncture, they are registered as immigrants. At a second point of their being transported, they are looked at as coolies. And at a third point, they're called indentured labor. And therefore, the shifting identities that datafication produces in earlier, but also in present times, because at every iteration of, interacting with these AI systems that are being installed everywhere, be it facial recognition technologies or biometric systems, for instance. The Aadhaar is, of course, been spoken about a lot and is a great example of, these high technology that we interface with on a regular basis. We see that people's experiences and lived experiences of interfacing with data and being governed as data becomes absolutely paramount to any story of data governance. And this is where I sort of take this is my point of departure from strictly legal studies, because I seek to move away from a documentary analysis to locate policy in the lived experiences of people. And this is the crux of really the two lines that summarize much of my interest in data governance. And just for the context in which my work is located, work done so far in data governance has, of course, drawn on law, studies in law and legal frameworks. People in IT and information system kind of work have been looking at data from a very technology perspective. The management folks have looked at data from a managerial perspective, where they talk about enterprise data management for the corporates and industry, and additional managerial perspectives to data. In public policy studies, of course, you have policy analysis of data related policies being brought in by government, that are being ushered in by governments. Public policy analysis is is something that happens quite often. Similarly, there's work in media and society, which looks at various forms of datafication, whether it be the gig economy and how labor intersects with datafication and AI systems, for instance. There's a lot of work happening in digital health, especially with new policies and even digital health IDs and identity systems being brought in by the government. We have new work happening in digital health all over again. There's also a lot of work on labor and social policy, and of course, like I mentioned, trade dynamics and the geopolitics between countries in terms of data flows. So this is a larger landscape in which work on datafication is happening. But my own location here is at the intersections of communication, governance, and media policy, historicizing the mobility and immobility of people as data, and in looking at the media industries in the form of the data industries. So I bring a very communication, governance, and policy and media industries perspective to my work. And that is really where I'm located. That's the ambit in which I'm located, which sort of sets my work apart from work that's already being done in the area of datafication. In terms of the sites that I operate in, of course, it is, I look at India, Malaysia, and Singapore. And this is not just in present times, but also historically. This is a one paragraph definition that really summarizes I don't want to call it a hypothesis, but really the starting point of my work, where I've broken it down into various aspects and phrases in order to explain it better. What I'm really trying to do in the study of data governance is to really understand the story of the making of what I call the Datacorp. So what is the Datacorp? The Datacorp is an umbrella term that I use for the data industries, which I argue are a particular manifestation of transnational capital as seen in the newer businesses that transact in and reinscribe the governance of people, their aspirations, and their mobility or immobility as data. So basically, I'm talking about newer businesses, newer entrants. Today, we have a number of startups of varying kinds who are all interested in the data, the business of data. They transact in data, they work with data, and they inscribe and reinscribe the governance of people, their aspirations, and their mobility or immobility as data. So really, I'm not talking about big tech here. Big tech could also be part of Datacorp, but I'm also talking about, for instance, a diagnostic center, which during the pandemic was really trading in people's data sets and health data. That was a big business during the pandemic, and diagnostic centers have been at the center of that during the pandemic. Similarly, I'm talking about those startups which are working with, the India stack, for instance, where they work with, a number of these entities like iSpert, for instance, which brings in a volunteer base from the technologists who work on data in various ways to enable the data industries. So what I'm really essentially trying to do is to study the story of the making of the Datacorp along these lines. And I argue that the Datacorp itself becomes a legitimate actor in data governance because they have antecedents in the East India Company, which is arguably the oldest corporation or one of the oldest corporations in the world. So I'm trying to make a link to the present day Datacorp, which makes up the data industries. And I'm trying to take it back to the essential aspect of governing people as data to the East India Company and its corporate ambitions, which resulted in the empire and imperium. And I'm trying to make that connect between the study of East India Company as the oldest form of Datacorp. So here are some of the elements that I draw from this sort of statement. The first is the making first aspect that I'll be looking at is the making of Datacorp in India and Singapore. And I hope to do this through the profiling of the contours of who are these data industries? What is the data economy like? And this would include a study of homegrown corporations, startups, transnational investments and transactions, exchanges and cooperation between Singapore and India, tech, labor, and mobility. And I'll give you an example of this. Late last year, the government of Telangana sort of got into, created a special investment portfolio and special investment incentives for companies, data companies from Singapore to set up base in Telangana in the outskirts of Hyderabad. And they envisaged this setting up and the building of data centers in these areas in the outskirts of Hyderabad. Similarly, you have a Reliance setting up, with tie-ups to Facebook. Facebook has close to a 10% investment in the GeoMart, and Reliance is setting up data centers in Navi Mumbai. So the data center industry is a huge industry. And Singapore is very famous for the data industry, for the data center industry. And I'm looking at the linkages between India and Singapore, specifically Delhi, Mumbai, and Maharashtra and Telangana, in order to study how the data center economy intersects with the data economy. And as part of that, I'll be studying these various elements of the Datacorp. The second element is the East India Company as the oldest manifestation of Datacorp. Here, I'll be, like I mentioned, this example of how people were governed as data. I'm going to be looking at the governing of people's mobility and immobility as data. And I say mobility and immobility, I'll come to that in a bit. And I hope to glean this from archival documents and oral history pertaining to the transport of indentured labor from British India to British Malaya and the Straits settlements. Element 3 is to look at how the Datacorp meets the state. So when it comes to policy, while we talk about multi-stakeholderism and while we talk about plural policy actors in the policy space, we understand that the state at the end of the day is the ultimate sort of arbitrator when it comes to policy, because they are the ones who are legislating on policy. And as much as it is influenced, it still has to go through a formal process, right? So how does the Datacorp meet the state? Here, I seek to look at how the Datacorp is a very influential policy actor in data governance. Much of the agendas for the governance of data comes from the Datacorp and the data industries. And I seek to sort of note this from the colonial times and private enterprise during the colonial times to the post-colonial era and the present times, where we can map the changing nature and role of the state. The state in the post-colonial era, because especially after independence, the state, especially in India, sort of became a repository of data. Aspects like census and the 5-year planning process, the planning commission, driven by the planning commission, were responsible and various aspects like the institutions like the ISI and the NSSO. Various measures were brought in to understand how the population behaved. So this is very much part of the behavioral study of populations. And today we have 1-year plans by the Niti Aayog. So this shift, especially from the post-colonial era to the 1970s, when software and the software industry was beginning, conversations around the software industry was beginning to happen, and private enterprise in IT was beginning to happen in India with a policy that was brought in the 1970s, to the present era, when we are talking about high technology driven privatization of data collection and datafication. This is a huge shift, but is it a huge shift, or do we have antecedents for the present in the past? So I'm trying to sort of map that trajectory where the Datacorp and the state interact closely. Here we have aspects like national interest and security being brought in. You have ideas of how the Datacorp derives its legitimacy, how it influences policy and is influenced by public policies and practices of data in India. For instance, and the next aspect is, of course, the governance of mobility and immobility of people. For instance, during the pandemic, you have the government coming up with a card for migrants, especially after the migrant or during the migrant crisis in India, where they spoke about how the ration card could be used in any place where the people were residing. And therefore, we have the shifting of the contours of datafication happening, the shifting of the contours continue to happen with the coming of digital IDs, digital health IDs, and the Aadhaar, for instance. We have the shifting of the contours happening with something like a FASTag, which really governs your mobility on the highways, right? So every time you undertake a trip to a far off place, perhaps in the outskirts of Delhi or in the NCR region, you have to use the FASTag to sort of cross places and register yourself. So it very much governs your mobility, but also immobility, because at every point you're rendered intelligible as data to the system, and you have to keep reiterating that process in order for it to render you visible to those who are studying you as data, right? So these are the three elements that I am looking at when it comes to work on data governance. The first is to look at the Datacorp, the making of the Datacorp. The second is to historicize that to the East India Company and as one of the earliest data corps. And the third is to look at how the Datacorp really meets the state, historically and in present times. So in terms of my theoretical frameworks, I'm actually just writing this up and developing this. My previous work has been on critical media policy studies, where I looked at how traditional media policy studies has privileged the state actor or the corporation. And the idea was to go beyond that, to study people in policy and to dislodge these very significant categories of the government and the state and its role in policy. Not that the state is not important, but it becomes important to center policy in people's lived experiences. And this is being spoken about again in critical data studies. So what I'm trying to do is to bring critical media policy studies and critical data studies in conversation with each other to lead to the framework of critical data governance. This is something that I'm actually just writing up. I'm working on a paper on this, which will be submitted hopefully by the end of this week. But what the key tenets of this approach do are that it underscores the assumption of objectivity of much of policy research, where much of policy research essentially is technocratic, because we see that it has historically been technocratic, managerial, and Eurocentric. So we have a particular idea of progress. It's a linear model of progress that we envisage. We don't understand that communities and people, there are the existence of multiple modernities and multiple temporalities of progress that people have, through the world, but also within India and within communities as well. So internal colonization is something that I'm very aware of, and I'm trying to ensure that critical data governance addresses that. And the move is to therefore underscore pluralism and decolonial aspirations. So the scholar called Julian Go from the US has spoken about something called the Southern Standpoint. The author draws on Raven Connell's work on the Southern theory to illustrate a Southern standpoint to study communities, to study anything, to study sociology and society. And what I'm trying to do essentially is to draw on the Southern standpoint and argue for a Southern standpoint to data, which I see is critical data governance, right? It addresses the lack of engagement from critical theory towards issues of gender, race, and caste. What I mean by this is critical theory of the Frankfurt School has been critiqued heavily for still being Eurocentric and still believing or following the linear progress of enlightenment, linear model of progress of enlightenment as put forth by enlightenment thought. And critical theory has been critiqued for being not for being absolutely for not weighing in on issues of race, gender, and caste. And Nancy Fraser has talked about it along gender lines, for instance. However, if you look at the works of Habermas, some of his works, you will see that he talks about how any idea of progress is only progress when it takes people along and when it is rooted in people. And therefore, I'm going to try and make that bridge from critical theory to decolonial aspirations and the Southern standpoint. This is, of course, a theoretical framework that I'm just developing, and it is evolving as we speak. In terms of the field work, my sites for ethnography would be, of course, I'll start off with the digital ethnography, which is currently underway, where I'm talking to people, I'm making observations online, I'm looking at policy documents and conversations on policy documents, where I understand the standpoints of various actors in the policy process for data. The idea is also to look at archival documents to understand how data governance has been there historically. The next aspect is to look at ethnography and oral histories. And I hope to do this ethnography in Hyderabad and New Delhi in India, Penang and Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and in Singapore. These are my sites for ethnography. And here are some of the constructs that I will be navigating. And each of it comes with its baggage and plus points and advantages. The first is there is a lot of work on the Indian Ocean worlds. So that is one construct that I hope to navigate in my work, especially because my work is located right, in conversations between South and Southeast Asia. The idea is to bridge the lack of research or the very little research that has happened that looks at South-South migration and mobility and South-South kind of work on between South and Southeast Asia specifically. And I hope to draw on the construct of the Indian Ocean worlds into this space. The second aspect, and this is very driven by China's focus on the digital Silk Route, where the digital Silk Route really is a very ambitious project that looks at how digital infrastructure and data infrastructure are being laid along this the older Silk Route. And this is part of China's huge plan to sort of lay infrastructures along this route. That is one construct that will play out in my work. And the third is the idea of the Asian century and Asianness, especially because I am looking at Southeast Asia, and this fits, and Singapore is seen as the epitome and the epitome of the story of the Asian development as part of the idea of the Asian century, and India features there as well in terms of the discourses around the Asian century. And therefore, the idea is to try and map that construct as well. In terms of the actionables, and this is the last slide, in terms of the actionables, I'm just working on a position paper on data governance as communication governance. Like I mentioned, the next aspect is to look at the story of the making of the Datacorp, which draws on the East India Company, trade and empire, present day data centers, treaties and MOUs on data flows, essentially mapping the data economy historically and in present times. The third aspect is to look at data imaginaries and governance. And for this, I will be drawing on Charles Taylor for his work on social imaginaries, and also various other works on socio-technical imaginaries, for instance. However, I don't essentially locate my work in the STS framework, and therefore I will still be drawing a lot more on the more political and political anthropological kind of work. I will be looking at tying together these three lenses with present day data governance in India, and looking at mobilities and immobilities with British Malaya, the Strait settlements, and present day mobility of labor between Singapore and India. So this is really the contours of what I hope to accomplish as part of this work on data governance, historicizing and contextualizing data governance and rooting it in people. And with that, I end my conversation here from my side, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that may come my way.
so much, Preeti, for sharing your very exciting and new research with us. With that, I'm going to invite questions and comments. Either you can write them out in the chat box or unmute yourself and speak. Okay, till they sort of prepare themselves to ask questions, let me begin by asking you two things, very clarificatory questions. But first, if you could talk a little bit about how you intend to use qualitative methods, since you mentioned oral history and ethnography, to do your research, A. And B, you talk about critical theory and decolonization. And since a lot of our listeners and viewers are also undergraduate students, it would be helpful if you could expand a little more on what you mean by those terms.
Sure. Thank you for those questions. So the first aspect about how I intend to use qualitative research, I mean, I am a qualitative researcher through and through. So when we think of data, we're all constantly thinking of the binary rendering of and the quantified kind of individual in data. But what I seek to do is to look at small data, right? And when I say small data, it means that I'm really looking at the lived experiences of people being governed as data. In order to do that, what I intend to do is to do an ethnography, something that I'm very familiar with from my previous work on policy ethnography, critical policy ethnography, where I will be embedding myself in locations where people are, people interface with these AI technologies, where I will be talking to policymakers through formal interviews, but also informal conversations. By policymakers, I mean policy actors across the spectrum, not just the government, but of course the government, but also a plurality of policymakers ranging from consultancy firms like Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers, for instance. Similarly, because they are big on influencing policy on data. Similarly, firms and think tanks, strategic firms that look at policy making for data, civil society actors, people who run research organizations who make advocacy for data along various lines. So I will be interviewing a lot of them. That is one. The second aspect is to embed myself in locations where these conversations are happening online and offline. So that would make for participant and non-participant observation. And the third aspect is to do a digital ethnography of these ongoing conversations. So the ethnography itself would be traditional, that is real-time ethnography and digital ethnography, as well as looking at bringing in observations into the picture. So that would be the qualitative research part. The second part about critical theory is, critical theory is it is an umbrella term. Critical theories in plural is an umbrella term for a range of theoretical frameworks that seek to dislodge the very objectivist kind of approach to research by bringing in subjectivities into the picture, and by ensuring that the idea of power is addressed continually, right? But what I'm referring to as critical theory is to bring in focus the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, so critical social theory, where the Frankfurt School has, been in the picture for close to a century now. We're talking about the fourth or fifth generation of Frankfurt School theorists. And I'm talking about the works of people like Habermas, but also work by people like Axel Honneth, who spoke about the struggle for recognition, Rainer Faust, for instance. So there are a range of theorists from the Frankfurt School who've addressed various aspects of social conflicts where induced by late capitalism, in the era of late capitalism, and I seek to locate my work there. However, the critique against the Frankfurt School has always been that they, even though they have taken a critical perspective to understanding society, they don't necessarily address aspects of race, caste, and gender. These have been levied by various scholars, including Nancy Fraser, for instance, where they talk about the counter public sphere, for instance, and the gendered public sphere. So the idea is to ensure that we bring in the idea of the decolonial. What does the decolonial mean? Decolonial has very specific connotations in the Western world, where you have aspects like indigenous data governance. I'm talking about it in the ambit of my work. Decolonization and decolonial theory is a very broad ambit. But when I situate it in my work, you already have indigenous data governance being brought in by indigenous groups in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand, and there are books on this. So essentially, it is the idea of owning the narrative, ensuring that extractivist practices can be countered by various groups. And this is something that we see in various other parts of the world as well. So to draw on critical theory and Southern theory to make and to put that in conversation and draw on critical theory for that, decolonial theory, critical theory, and Southern theory, and bring them in conversation with each other in order for critical theory to contend with race, caste, and gender is what my attempt would be.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you for the explanation. So there is a question in the chat box by Anshu.
Right. So what do you mean by digital ethnography? Well, digital ethnography, again, has happened with the coming of new technologies like the internet and the digital space. And it's at least a couple of, if not more than a couple of decades old. Much of the work started in the late 1990s. And for instance, people were looking at that time, chat rooms, for instance, as a phenomenon, or they were looking at gaming as a space where ethnography was being conducted. For instance, Second Life was a big aspect of, featured a lot in digital ethnography. So what do you mean by digital ethnography is not just looking at things online, but it means that you're studying specific people, specific groups, specific characteristics, making observations of the tonality, making observations of the various interactions online in a specific place or space with a specific context in mind and with specific questions in mind. So that is the idea of digital ethnography in short. It's taken various phases. For instance, there was ethnography, there is online ethnography, there is digital ethnography, and it has taken various kinds of phases alongside the various technological developments that have taken place through these 3 decades. So that's what, and how am I going about it in my work? For instance, I think during the pandemic, all researchers were looking at various ways of doing research, especially because we couldn't go to our traditional fields and conduct ethnography. And in my case, when it came to data governance and policy, much of the conversations on policy were happening online. For instance, the entity Media Nama, which tracks technology policy in India, was organizing a lot of these policy dialogues online on various policies by the government. Policy making in that sense and policy consultations were happening online as well. We have MPs and MLAs coming on board, corporations coming on board, and the data industries, representatives of the data industries coming on board these conversations and discussing aspects of data governance in these spaces. And I've been sort of tracking those conversations. I've been reading reports and analysis on it. And I've been looking at interviews and discussion pointers from a lot of these forums where one could easily conduct a digital ethnography. I was also part, or I am also a part of a Telegram group, which I won't name for various purposes, but the Telegram group itself was started by a bunch of people in opposition to Aadhaar. So it is very rooted in a specific kind of conversation in civil society. So that particular group helps me sort of get perspective on various other nuances to data governance. And as a participant in the group, I have made presentations on the first non-personal data report that the government came up with and presented, made a presentation to them on that. And we've written about it for the News Minute and a couple of other blogs. So that is really the kind of digital ethnography that I'm doing for this project.
Any other questions? Harsha, do you have a question or?
Yes, I'm just curious. Hi, Preeti. Thanks for your new research. I'm very happy to know about your new project. I was just thinking, because you are familiar with Nepal, I'm also thinking about this datafication happening in Nepal. So
Right.
I'm just curious to know how we can understand the datafication in a country which, it was never colonized. So do you have
Right,
any
that's
idea?
true. So yeah, but I mean, one of the things that featured in my previous work, where I did do field work on Nepal, as you are aware already, is to bring in the idea of crypto colonialism, which
Mhm.
Herzfeld, anthropologist Herzfeld has spoken about, where Nepal, while not being a formal colony, was very much, the administrative setup was very much influenced by the British Empire,
Right.
because of trade relations with the British in India, for instance, and various other parts of the empire. So the Nepalese administrative setup, especially prior to the 1950s, from in the through the imperial period, was very much influenced by crypto coloniality. And now there are people who are talking about post crypto coloniality. So that's really how I sort of position Nepal in the picture to study datafication. But what is interesting is coloniality is not something that was in the past. It is an ongoing kind of process as well. Colonialism is an ongoing process in the way we have internal colonizations of various kinds as well, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, in that sense, I mean, I was just reading the update from Body and Data, where they were talking about how there's a invasion of privacy in the election records that's happening right now, where datafication of electoral records is happening, and it was published online in a big way. This is something that's happening as we speak in Nepal, and I mean, they're putting out these uh, campaigns to counter that. That's what I mean, that's the last notification I have from Body and Data.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Wait, there's something in the chat box. No. So I actually wanted to ask another question, but there is also one more question. So if you could take Shreya's question, and I'll add my question to it in terms of, I wanted to know how you would look at ethics while doing research on a topic such as datafication and digital ethnography, because you mentioned that you are in a Telegram group, but you're not naming it, right? So it just sort of leads me to ask about ethics.
Right. So in fact, I mean, so this is an ongoing conversation, right? I mean, for instance, when I wanted to join the Telegram group and I got to know about it, the first thing that I told them was that I'm conducting research. I'm here as an academic researcher. And I mean, at various points when we have these conversations, I ensure that I make it clear that I am here, and some of the conversations might be taken into consideration for my research. So that's something that the participants in the Telegram group are very aware of. However, when it comes to social media research, unless it's a private group, or research on Twitter, for instance, qualitative research on Twitter, because much of the conversation is public and it is meant to be public, then the boundaries of what is private and what is public gets blurred. And it also, I mean, in some ways, people are aware that their tweets or their social media posts could be looked at for research purposes in various ways. However, I think the onus of the ethics lies with the researcher. And I mean, personally, I make it a point to have a clarification right in the beginning with people that I'm observing or groups that I'm part of, to tell them that this is part of research and I will not be naming anybody unless they want to be named. And that's something that I've carried right through my previous research, whenever I've conducted qualitative research, which are at least on 2 projects, if not more. Uh, Especially one massive project where at some points activists want to be named, but at some points they do not want to be named. People from the government at various points want to be named, but at various points do not want to be named. So I think allowing them to take the call on it is part of the ethical consideration. The third aspect is, of course, my own positionality. And this becomes complex. It was complex in my previous research when I was conducting research across 4 countries and doing a policy ethnography across 4 countries, because India acts as a big brother in the region in various ways. And when I was doing policy ethnography in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, when I was visiting these countries, I would often be seen as a particular national of a particular country, especially when I was going to the government offices and ministries. And therefore, it becomes important to be very clear about your own positionality, one, in terms of your nationality, if you're doing transnational research, but also in terms of your gender, caste, class. I mean, all these intersecting kind of locations shape you, render you advantages in some ways, and can be disadvantages for you in various ways. For instance, I've had some very scary experiences being a female researcher in South Asia, conducting ethnography and traveling through 4 countries in South Asia. However, I'm also aware of the privileges that come with being, from a country like India and trying to conduct research in various other countries, which are seen as smaller, in South Asia. And therefore, I'm very aware of the power dynamics when I speak as a scholar in a particular place, but in another place as a seeker of information vis-a-vis a government official or a ministry, for instance. I knew that I was being tracked in Sri Lanka because of my linguistic background. This was just after the war in Sri Lanka, when the post-conflict situation was not, it was not as open as it is now for researchers to go and study. And right now there is, different kind of situation in Sri Lanka, but the post-conflict kind of situation has, it is ongoing, but it has opened up the economy and the places have been opened up. But I could not, for instance, conduct research in north and east of Sri Lanka at that point. So that's what I meant when I said I was navigating positionalities. Digital ethnography also renders you invisible and visible in various ways vis-a-vis your positionality, and it becomes important to clarify that at various junctures.
Right. So there is also a question by Shreya in the chat box. She wanted to know your opinion on digital health initiatives, and in this context, wanted to ask how we should look at public interest technology, such as mobile health apps for disease monitoring, issuing of IDs, but does not necessarily govern access to services through ID systems like Aadhaar. Is colonization or surveillance an adequate trope here?
Right. It is not an adequate trope because public interest technologies, in fact, I am a champion or a crusader for public interest technologies that are truly public. It's not, the technology can be open source, but unless it is part of a public system that is truly public, it is only that, it can only go that far. And therefore, open source, open technologies and open data systems are great, but it also does not augur well when it is part of a closed circuit and an opaque circuit in which it is actually being made and processed and put out into the world. When that world itself is opaque, it becomes very difficult for public interest technology to manifest as just that. Having said that, you're right, colonization or surveillance is not an adequate trope because you have people leveraging public interest technology in true public interest. And therefore, theorizing public interest, theorizing subversion and inversion of power becomes important. And that's something that I hope to do when I do the ethnography with people, where I'm looking at how people have various competencies and literacies, data literacies, critical data literacies, when it comes to interfacing with technologies such as AI. How do they subvert those systems is something that makes for a very fascinating study. And I'm hoping that my research would yield that kind of insight.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Dipali, go ahead.
Yes, just one second. Yeah, thank you, Preeti, for that session. It was just amazing listening to you. So my question is sort of based on the point that you were making about say indigenous communities in Canada or say Australia. I think you mentioned how they have their own data and they are sort of deciding as to what sort of data they want to have about themselves. But I was just curious, say if you say, datafication in the Indian context, and if we club it with the question of democracy, I'm not sure if you're looking at it in your research, but I was just curious, say a lot of questions on governance and democracy in India are still connected with the traditional forms or the colonial methods of datafication, such as the census. Take for example the delimitation which happens in states. So in that, with that context and with that background, are you also trying to look at how the colonial forms of datafication still are prevalent? Because when people want to put across their rights or their demands, that data again comes into the picture. So I was just curious if you're trying to look at that as well.
Yeah, this is a conundrum because there are two kinds of datafication. One is, of course, analog datafication, which is becoming digital, and one is high technology driven datafication through AI systems, etc. But the conundrum here is in various ways, like for instance, with the caste census, people want to be counted. People want to procure their rights. They want to lay claim to social security measures. They want to lay claim to their identities. And therefore, in that case, it's not about taking a stand as to whether datafication is right or wrong. It's about bringing nuances of diverse people's experiences to the process of datafication and the process of data governance. For instance, I was reading this book on indigenous data governance, and people talk about how they very much want to be represented, and they don't want to be part of a data set where they are seen as a problem or just another variable. Right? It's not about representation in that sense. It's about truly being there as part of, showcasing the whole as a holistic picture of the population and being part of that population in a holistic way. So that is one. And that is why they do not say that of course, there are problems with invasive technologies and surveillance. But what they are doing is they are taking sort of laying claim to those spaces, and they are taking over the spaces and they are making it their own. And therefore, they are governing it by their own rules and by their own standards. And there they are drawing on various ideas of the commons or intellectual property that is rooted in traditional knowledge systems, for instance, because it's not one individual's data that you can own. So how does intellectual property intersect with data governance? So these are all areas that we are still developing. And I don't think there is much work that's happening on India, barring work on the caste census and conversations around the caste census. But I think this is something we can draw inspiration from and learn from indigenous data governance, for instance.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? I guess not. So we actually end at 7:30. Thank you, Preeti, once again for sharing your research with us. And we hope we get to read a lot of good papers as well as blog pieces, hopefully one for doing sociology as well. And once again, thank you from all of us, especially me and Dipali, for being here and sharing your research.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to share a vision for my work, because it's not always that you get to sort of share your ideas from the initial stages. And I hope, to keep the engagement going. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the recording will be uploaded to our blog and YouTube channel and Facebook page. So whoever wants to catch it later can, catch it there. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.